evening and welcome. Tonight on For the Record, we're joined by two very distinguished guests, and our discussion this evening is based on how the United Nations is supporting Fiji during the current crisis. Joining us, our first guest in studio is Mr. Sanaka Samarasinha, Fiji's UN Resident Coordinator. So, good evening and welcome to the show.
Good evening, Ziad. Thank you.
And joining us remotely as well is Mr. Satendra Prasad. He is Fiji's ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations. Mr. Prasad, thank you for your time and thank you for joining us this evening.
Good evening, Mr. Ziad. Very nice. Pleasure to join you.
So our first question to you, Mr. Samarasinha. The COVID-19 cases, as you are well aware, have been drastically increasing in Fiji. Over the past week, we've had a dramatic increase in case numbers, and we've reached some of our highest numbers. What is the UN's take on the situation that is currently unfolding in Fiji?
Well, anytime you have community transmission, Ziad, it's quite concerning. And of course, we've seen some dramatic increases in numbers over the last couple of days. Thankfully, we have not seen large numbers requiring hospitalization. And we've not seen, as is the case in some other countries, these positive case numbers accompanied with increase in the number of deaths. Now, yesterday, the Permanent Secretary for Health explained that this could in part be because we've had younger people who've been testing positive. Thankfully, not so many older people, but this will not last. And as the community transmission increases, numbers increase, young people go back to their homes, their communities, you're going to have older people, people with underlying health conditions, comorbidities as we call it, being exposed to the virus. So we have to still be very careful. The other thing, of course, is that we've seen a significant increase in the number of vaccinations. Now, I'm very pleased to see that we've got up to about 40%, I think, at last count. Of course, that still means 60% need even the first jab. Now, with 40% receiving the first jab, that is likely that most of them, if not all of them, will not see serious symptoms of COVID-19, even if they do become COVID-19 positive. So there are some positives to take away. But I think what we do know is that the worst is not over yet. We will see increasing numbers, and we really need to be able to get over the next 3 months or so, get those remaining population vaccinated, get the second jabs in, and then try to minimize the number of cases that end up in hospitals. And of course, in the meantime, we really have to figure out a way to keep our frontline workers safe, healthcare workers. So from the UN's point of view, we've been working on a daily basis. The World Health Organization is practically in the Ministry of Health, and they work closely throughout the day, every day. We have agencies like UNICEF that's continuously bringing in supplies, storing them in a warehouse, and helping the government to distribute. And a number of other agencies are also working in other sectors.
Thank you for that. We'll go to you, Mr. Prasad. Once again, thank you for joining us. And same question to you. What is your take on the current crisis unfolding in Fiji, how it's happening? And also, what type of support has Fiji sought from the UN during the current COVID-19 crisis?
Thank you, Ziad. Yes, it is worrisome, the current trend. It is following very known patterns. When there's outbreak, there's an exponential increase. And so we need to be very disciplined about this to avoid suffering and a lot of pain downstream. And as Mr. Sanaka said, it is good that serious cases have been fewer, and let's hope that we can maintain this trajectory. But there are tough few months ahead, and the country needs to be very disciplined about this. About the UN, from very much day one, or even in the pre-day zero, when there were a lot of discussion on whether there was a pandemic and when a pandemic should be announced, the UN has been involved with Fiji as with the rest of the world. Firstly, via WHO, and the cases of concerns were registered and a pandemic declared, and then through technical advice that has been coming to the Ministry for Health as well as to government on a daily and second by second basis on its level of understanding on what are the best practices to tackle this. This is long before the vaccines were on the horizon. So there's that phase at which it provided critical assistance as well as emergency support for the health system to be able to cope with a potential outbreak, and fantastically sort of avoided a very bad outcome in the first phase. Now we are dealing with the second phase, but this has given the whole system and the UN and Fiji government to walk through in a cohesive way on what is the nature of support that is best suited to Fiji given its need. Of course, the first and foremost is vaccines, and as you know, through the COVAX facility that is associated with the World Health Organization, some 20% countries are eligible for 20% of vaccines, and some 60,000 has already arrived. That was in the early few months back, and I understand the remainder 40,000 should be arriving towards the end of the month, and Mr. Sanaka can give you more precise dates about that. That was a very helpful intervention by the UN, because these initial vaccines put us ahead of the curve. It allowed Fiji to, first of all, vaccinate frontline workers, the healthcare workers, because they're your first line of defense, and they help us deal with this, with COVID-19. And so that gave some amount of stability and strength in the system, allowed the medical system to position themselves for outbreak, and by the time an outbreak came, they're reasonably well prepared. Not reasonably well prepared, I'd say one of the better prepared countries by any standards, by global standards actually. So that's first part. Second, through, as Mr. Sanaka has said, in the early period, there's a bit of that is lost perhaps in the details when the global airline system had shut down. It was very difficult to move supplies. One, to source supplies, medical supplies, and second, to move supplies when borders had shut down. And the UN played an extremely important role in operating a humanitarian pathway, in forging through a humanitarian pathway in the Pacific that allowed flights to come into Fiji and across the Pacific region, and bringing supplies in and out. And I must really thank the UN for having responded, as well as very courageously working the details through it, because it required many, many governments to work together. And the humanitarian pathway, once established, allowed PPE, and medical equipment, as well as normal drugs which could no longer come into the country, medicines which could no longer come into the country because of flight interventions, for these supplies to be maintained in that period. So they played a fantastic role in working through with the government in its developing its knowledge and understanding of what we are dealing with and what were the best approaches. Then in second set of interventions, providing equipment and the support that was needed, equipment, medicines, and that category of things. And the third, very important part, opportunity for Fiji to be sharing its own practices with other countries. And, you know, all countries are learning from each other. Fiji is learning from New Zealand and Australia, and they are learning from other countries. So it's provided a platform for knowledge sharing and exchange on what works, what does not work, when do you change tactics, when do you use different modalities, what type of clinical practice, how do you manage community stresses, etc. So this has also been a very important part of the UN support.
Stay with us. We'll be back after a short break. Welcome back to the show. Mr. Samara Sinha, let's talk about the government's response, Fijian government's response to the current pandemic and how effective it has been. So there's a debate going around and a lot of discussion going around on what would have been the best strategy. And the current debate, I think, is on whether elimination or mitigation is the better option. We'd just like to get your opinions on this. How do you see the government's response to this current outbreak?
Ziad, first of all, I've been noting with a little bit of concern that there is a conversation going on as to whether or not there is a plan. In fact, I think the Permanent Secretary yesterday referred to this point and said, look, there's always been a plan. And I just wanted to remind those who may have forgotten and to inform those who may not know. Because of the measles crisis in the Pacific, there was something called a Joint Incident Management Team that was pulled together here in Suva with the World Health Organization leading it to respond to the measles pandemic. And this Joint Incident Management Team was repurposed to deal with COVID-19 back in January of 2020. And one of the things that the Joint Incident Management Team did, along with the Fiji Joint Incident Management Team and other countries in the Pacific, was to support the preparation of plans to mitigate, plans to prepare, first of all to prepare for a pandemic, then to mitigate, and then to respond. And of course, these plans need to be updated, these plans need to be implemented, which requires a degree of political will and efficiency. So first of all, there is a plan. There was always a plan, and that's possibly one of the reasons why in the Pacific you actually saw a great deal of success for such a long time. You know, as we get into these discussions and debates, we forget that Fiji is one of the very few countries in the world that did not have community transmission for a whole year, because there was a plan, because those plans were updated, and because those plans were implemented. So that is important to note. Secondly, we have had a whole year and some months to learn from other people's experiences, their successes, their mistakes. And I think, as Ambassador Prasad was mentioning in the previous segment, you know, this is one of the things that the UN presents to countries, to its member states. It's the best practice, the global experience when it comes to anything at all. And one of the positives, if you can call it that, about this global pandemic is that it's global. So the world is the laboratory. And what we have learned from other countries are being now presented to the Fiji government for it to make decisions like every sovereign country will. And the thing, of course, is that these are complex issues. You know, do you lock down? How long do you lock down for? Which areas do you lock down? And every country will have to make those decisions based on not only the health concerns, the social, the cultural, the economic, the political aspects of a country and a society, and that balancing act needs to happen. We have seen that, you know, extended lockdowns have other consequences. People die of other reasons, such as not having access to health care that they need. Food security is a great concern because people don't have income. Even if they do finally manage to find food, nutrition is a big problem, has been around the world. We've seen problems, significant problems with mental health. We've seen significant problems with violence, domestic violence. So there are very many different aspects to this lockdown, and it needs to be balanced. So what I can say is, you know, these are all being considered, the way I see it, by the authorities. We provide input from what we understand, including the health aspects, and then those decisions are being made. I think the last thing I want to say on this, Ziad, is that it's important that we all, citizens and those of us who live here in Fiji, take responsibility for our own actions. The fact that you don't have a 24/7 curfew doesn't mean that you have to leave your house unless you really have to leave your house. Doesn't mean that you should, when you do leave your house, that you forget about all the basics of being safe. You need to wear your mask, you need to practice social distancing, you need to make sure you wash your hands, you need to try and avoid closed spaces and close contact. These kinds of things, need to be adopted by everybody. And ultimately, very, very lucky, as I kept saying, that we've got access to vaccines, which is not the case in so many places around the world. So we really need to encourage our friends and family to go and get vaccinated. Today, we had a vaccination drive in the UN offices where more than 150 people got their jabs. But we still need to keep at it to dispel all these myths and misinformation around the vaccines, because vaccines save lives.
So just stemming from your answer, some of the important points you raised, of course, the UN was there in helping the Pacific get their plans ready. So when you talk about assistance, there's two aspects to it. Number one is the assistance that you provide to the Ministry of Health, medical-wise. And the other, the more, I guess, urgent one we've seen during the second outbreak is the socio-economic assistance and the effect that this outbreak has had on livelihoods in Fiji. How is the UN continuing to help Fiji during both of these crises?
The UN Secretary General set up a global fund following the pandemic last year. And the Secretary General's COVID-19 Response Fund provides some resources to Fiji. That's part of it. So I think about 2 million Fiji dollars is targeting those who are in the informal sector in particular, because as you know, around the world, people who work in the informal sector largely tend to be women, and of course have very little or no access to social protection schemes. So we wanted to make sure we target those resources. But in addition to that, we have just in the 2020-2021, we have somewhere around 36 million Fiji dollars focused on different sectors and livelihoods, in terms of supporting systems to respond to or prevent cases of violence against women and girls, children in general. We have helped coordination mechanisms across ministries. Of course, a number of different initiatives, as you mentioned, in the health sector, with PPE, distribution of PPEs from the police force to frontline health workers. And then, of course, setting up this transport hub that Ambassador Prasad mentioned to ensure that these supplies for COVID-19 as well as for other healthcare needs come into Fiji and get distributed, because Fiji is a hub for this part of the Pacific, and so we also make sure that countries like Kiribati and Tuvalu and Solomon Islands, Tonga, get supplies from here.
We'll ask the next question to Mr. Prasad. Mr. Prasad, what should Fiji expect from the UN system post-COVID-19?
Thanks. I'll two parts. One is the health challenge itself, and should, as far as I understand, PGA is following very much the textbook on how COVID-19 should be contained and the approach that it should take. This is certainly the global best practice. There isn't much variation in the way in which this is being done in other countries. And remember, Fiji. So, we are talking about Viti Levu still. The rest of the parts are very much contained, and there's little evidence I'm seeing. I'm not current to the domestic news of community spread, which is a very good thing. It might not stay that way, but it is so far a very good thing. I also want to reaffirm the point of individual responsibility and family responsibility. I'm talking to you from New York. Anybody who might have seen some of the media coverage of New York, sort of summer last year, June, July, May last year. This was like a war zone. It was very, very rough. But people took responsibility, and this is long before there was vaccine. People took responsibility. They stayed at home. They created family bubbles. They masked themselves from the rare moments that they had to go out to shops or to walk in the emergency sector. You masked yourself up, you washed your hands, you family protected each other, and families behaved as a unit that took care of other, as if you were in a war on a war footing. You really had to walk that way, and that same applies to my own family. There was a period in which I think for good 29 days we had not set one foot out of our house. And on the rare time that one of us thereafter had to go out, as soon as you come in, you sanitize yourself, or probably stay locked in a separate room in your own house to protect the rest of the family. So that level of responsibility is so important, so important. And sometimes I think a young might not take this seriously, but because I'd like to use this opportunity to share some of our New York experience. Young, by doing these things which are very difficult, do not come easy to young people. They need to understand that by doing so, they're essentially protecting their parents or their grandparents, their uncles and aunts, who may be staying in their same household or neighboring household. So this is a very important part of the responsibility of churches and religious organizations. They all have a very important role to play in ensuring that families take care of themselves, they protect each other, and that one family also takes care of another family by staying away from that family. This is part of it. Going forward, as with every other country, there's nothing unique about Fiji. This is going to be a difficult recovery. It is the social and economic recovery from COVID will be difficult. And Fiji is slightly more difficult. We're a small island state, so in any case, we face so many disadvantages in the global economy, in our trade relations, in being able to attract investors in small countries, with ongoing climate crisis. All of these things create so many disadvantages. So we have to steel ourselves up, be prepared for a medium to long recovery. But as sure as the sun comes out, there will be a recovery. I know the government is thinking through very hard the strategies and approaches that it should take, working very, very closely with the UN, with the whole of the UN system, and that includes the multilateral institutions such as the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, that they are all working together very cohesively in mapping out Fiji's medium to long-term recovery so that jobs and enterprises get back on stream. We have to get past the COVID, of course. We have to get past the vaccine immunization. We have to reach 80% plus of the immunization, which is not too far. I don't have the the calendar of vaccination that will be available to Fiji, but I hope that Fiji will complete or achieve near 80% towards the second quarter of this year, which would be very impressive for a developing country. Would be way ahead of many of our competitors, and that allows the economy then to begin a measured opening up to international travel and so on. So that's all part of the mix. Fiji will have to, in the UN system, I hope, and I'm quite certain will be fully available to the government of Fiji to think through how to repurpose industries, what are the type of industries that you want to expand in the short term that give you a lot of jobs, that create livelihoods, that create green livelihoods, sustainable livelihoods that earn us foreign exchange. So we need to move a lot more in those sectors and perhaps a little bit less in more traditional sectors, re-establish, build agriculture and food security to much higher levels, but also begin to exploit export markets, attract smart industries who can quickly, with much agility, invest in Fiji, not industries which will take many, many years to relocate, take advantage of Fiji's good education and high levels of graduates that are available in the system. So across the whole of the system, the UN as a system is capable of providing targeted both financial, technical capacity, as well as the knowledge type of expertise that Fiji might want to call on. And I know there are lots and lots of discussions happening right now. I understand it may have just concluded. The UNDP, United Nations Development Program, has been having consultations with the Fijian government and meetings with several ministries already in the last week, thinking about how the United Nations Development Program should position itself in support of Fiji's economic rehabilitation that needs to be undertaken. I do not know what the outcomes of that mission is, but very soon I'm sure there will be press reports as soon as these discussions are concluded. And so the UN as a system, as I said, as a system, it should be available to a country like Fiji in a cohesive way, in a joined up way, and responsive to how people and government of Fiji think about their socioeconomic response to the COVID crisis. And it is very much there involved in all the big discussions. And here based in New York, we are playing our role in ensuring that there's a cohesive and work, and where needed, we link up the UN system to other development partners who, other countries who might be interested in supporting UN programs. For example, in a bit of the health, quite a considerable amount of the health recovery underway right now via the UN is funded through the European Union. We've had lots and lots of discussions about that and how the European support can be scaled up and repurposed, as well as with the governments of Australia and New Zealand, Canada, and so many other countries who are providing support into the UN system that then is drawn down by Fiji. So we know that there's a great possibilities ahead, and I'm quite confident that Fiji and the UN as a system will work very cohesively in mapping and then working through a comprehensive recovery program.
We'll go to a short break, ladies and gentlemen, and we'll be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back. Mr. Samarasinha, last week the Attorney General highlighted Fiji's response to COVID-19 and the potential areas of support that the UN could provide to enable post-COVID-19 recovery, both swift and equitable. What are some of the areas that you are aware of that is being looked into at the moment?
Well, one of the challenges, of course, even pre-COVID for small island developing states like Fiji, was the issue of finance, access to concessionary finance or finance on the basis of terms which will not put the small island countries into further debt. And I believe the Attorney General has continuously and consistently made this plea that we overhaul the global system of financial networks. And one of the things I can say that's happening in the UN right now, and in fact my office is engaged along with the office in Samoa and Barbados and other small island countries, is the development of what we call a multi-vulnerability index. You know, most financial institutions look at GNI as the per capita, as the benchmark on the basis of which finances can be provided. Whether you're a least developed country or a low income country or a high income country, it all depends really on GNI. And the point, of course, is, you know, whilst GNI is a good indicator, it's not sufficient, and especially not sufficient for small island countries like Fiji, when one cyclone can wipe out 40% of your GDP. So I'm hopeful that this multi-vulnerability index, which takes into account, amongst other things, natural disasters and climate change, will be included in the global system on how finance is made available to countries around the world, including small island developing states like Fiji. Additionally, I think what this has shown us is, you know, like in any crisis, we can turn this into an opportunity. Now, we keep saying build back better but after a crisis, but we don't always do that. And it's sometimes difficult because you don't have the resources, and therefore you think, you know what, let's just fix it for now and we'll do something later. Except by the time you get around to thinking about it, the next crisis has set in. I think this is really an opportunity for us to look at a number of different industries. Take tourism, for instance. You know, Fiji is highly dependent on tourism, but the industry is not as green and sustainable as we would like it to be. What if there's another pandemic? What have we learned? Can we use technology, digitalization, for example, to build a degree of resilience in the industry? Can we do more, now that we've seen the value of agriculture in Fiji, to ensure that food that is being produced in Fiji is actually being consumed by the tourists and not being imported from around the world? Can we do more to make sure that people across Fiji, the most vulnerable groups, benefit from an industry like tourism so that it is actually inclusive? Can we do more to attract different types of tourists to Fiji? Fiji has beautiful beaches, but Fiji has a lot more than beautiful beaches. How can we look at niche markets, and how can we maybe potentially market this product that Fiji has, which, you know, including culture, a lot better than we do? And, you know, UN agencies like UNESCO, the World Tourism Organization, work on this. And just speaking on tourism, I've been engaging with the World Tourism Organization, which is a UN organization, along with other UN agencies, to see if we could actually help Fiji develop a tourism recovery plan, along with other countries in the Pacific like Vanuatu and Palau. And the last thing I wanted to mention is in terms of inclusion. I think one of the things that this pandemic has taught us is that whilst it has affected all of us, it doesn't necessarily affect all of us in the same way. Right. Some of us have stronger coping mechanisms, perhaps because our purchasing power, our savings, whatever, are stronger, are larger. And so I think a greater analysis of how crisis affects people who are most vulnerable, who are already vulnerable, and to ensure that we have a system in place for the equitable response is fundamental.
Mr. Prasad, will give that same question to you. What areas is the UN looking into specifically to accommodate or facilitate a swift and equitable post-COVID-19 recovery?
Thanks. Again, as Mr. Sanaka has said, will state that point. First and foremost, for countries like Fiji, it is difficult to access finance because you are small. For many private investors, they do not get the level of scale that they need for large investments. So there are many layers of problems. So the UN as a system, including the World Bank and IMF, are working very well with Fiji in terms of trying to push the door and push the bar on Fiji's access to concessionary business finance at very, very near zero. That needs to be repaid over long periods of time, 30 years and more. And both the Honorable Prime Minister and Honorable Attorney General are leading the charge on why small states, which are highly vulnerable already to climate crisis, need access to these types of financing. And they've very well recognized and respected voices. And more countries are beginning to see that countries like ours face a systemic disadvantage. So we know that the UN is working with small states in this space, and we know that quite a few changes will be taking place. Already, I must say, in the World Bank, for example, Fiji is beginning to be able to access concessionary financing, even though we're a middle-income country. And that's a spectacular success to Fiji's economic diplomacy at work, and for Attorney General and the Prime Minister for leading the charge on this internationally, and through the support of the UN, through countries such as Australia and New Zealand, we have been changing the levers in the international system already, but we need to go much further. So that's one part. The second part is that the Fijian government is working with the UN in more targeted financing streams. For example, Mr. Sanaka talked about green recovery, and Fiji is beginning to access climate finance, and climate finance is beginning to be applied to things like building resilience in water systems in Suvarnasuri corridor, in building resilience of communities against sea level rise, and looking at both generating electricity while doing commercial agriculture and levuka. So it is building up a strong pipeline of programs via the UN system, and this is through the Green Climate Fund, and we know that that will go much further. Then the government is the UN and the government are working together on trying to access a lot more blue finance. A good part of Fiji's recovery will, as Sanaka has said, will be in this blue and green space. So we have to look at our oceans and our land differently, from a much more sustainability perspective, more climate-friendly perspective. And the number of investments, one of the investments is about protecting coral reefs and helping coral reefs recover better and faster. And that requires actions both on the reefs, but also that requires action on the land use, fertilizer and chemical use on land, and how rivers and reefs are linked. So there's investments that are beginning to flow, that are creating jobs, that are creating interesting jobs, new jobs, and calling for new sets of skills, looking for talent of our young in different ways. So that's another area in which UN and Fiji are working. So both in special sectors as well as generally in terms of access to concessional financing, the UN as a system is working with the Fiji government in this. We know that the recovery will need to focus on jobs first. So we need to create jobs so people have incomes. These jobs must be coming differently. They cannot be simply a return to the food. Second, we need to be creating livelihoods so people can derive livelihoods, and that may be in the ocean sector, that may be in the agricultural sector, with greater security, with instruments such as crop financing, with instruments such as financing after disasters. Right now, many of our poorer households lose it all after every climate catastrophe, after every cyclone. Some 20, 30 years of life savings are wiped away. There's nothing that they get some food and some emergency support at the end, but they have to, by and large, rebuild their homes themselves. So if we had an insurance market that takes care of that, so there's an automatic payout when climate catastrophes strike, that would be a good way for our poorer households to be able to recover faster. So the UN and Fiji government are working on developing this type of products as well that will help build much more resilient. So across the whole range, across the whole waterfront, there's lots of exciting work happening, and I must say that they will create great opportunities that will give us a different direction of the economy. And we just, I want to wish, great speed and great success in many of these efforts.
Just another question to you. From small island developing states to larger developing and developed countries, a lot of countries and governments have had to readjust their resource allocation and their list of priorities. Can the same be said for the UN? And how has COVID-19 affected the work of the United Nations?
Sanaka?
That's to you, Mr. Prasad.
Okay, thanks. So UN as a system, yes, indeed, this is difficult times globally. The major donors to the UN system are undergoing the same level of pain and hardship that Fiji is going through. It's a global pandemic. There's no question about that. So a lot of prioritization is at play within the UN system. A lot more focus on what is the most important thing, and what is less important is prioritized less. So focus on the urgent, immediate, and so these type of actions are taking place. But the UN will also say is adjusting to a new world and looking at more innovative ways of financing programs, beginning to work much better with the private sector, being able to source private sector financing. Some of the programs I've already described to you is actually UN providing capacity, experts, etc., which helps to draw in private sector financing, both in the blue space and in the green recovery that Fiji is shaping up for. There's lots and lots of examples already happening, and this is very positive. And some of the cases, some of the successes Fiji will be showing very soon will be of world class. I can tell you that with a great amount of certainty. We are really leading the charge in the way in which a more innovative UN system in any of the space, in gender, in the blue financing, in green projects, in livelihoods. It's beginning to work very differently, where it provides core resources, but it is beginning to open up private sector financing in ways that we could not have imagined long ago. So it's a UN that is adjusting. There's a lot of drive and a lot of energy and enthusiasm about it. As I speak, tomorrow morning, there's a global business leaders forum of the UN, and the UN is Secretary General. We all are talking to something like the world's 60 or 70 largest companies over the next 2-3 days on how they can work better together. And so this is part of a new UN that is shaping up quite well. I know there'll be frustration that things are not happening fast enough, and I agree with that, but certainly the train is moving in the right direction.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Prasad. Mr. Sanaka Sinha, just coming back to you, what's the message that you have for the people of Fiji on behalf of the UN in your position, and how do you see the way forward?
Well, that's a very broad question, Zia, but let me try to answer it, perhaps referencing your previous question to Ambassador Prasad, the UN belongs to all of us. You know, the first three words of the preamble is "we the peoples." Sometimes it's difficult to think of it that way. We think of it as some animal that exists over there in New York and makes decisions on all our behalf. At times that perception is accurate, and at other times it's misinformed. The UN is also an old animal. You know, we just celebrated the 75th anniversary last year, as you know, and we're now going into the 76th year. And it was created as an institution at a different time to address specific problems that existed at that time, amongst other things, to prevent a third world war, to try to address the challenges of colonialism, which countries like Fiji and my own, Sri Lanka, happened to actually be colonies. We were not even independent countries. So it's a very different world that we live in. And the UN absolutely has to adapt and respond to the challenges that we face now and we are likely to face in the future. So one of the things that the UN has undergone is a major reform initiative. I've worked in the UN for more than 20 years, and I know that we've had attempts at reforming this organization that belongs to all of us several times. But this Secretary General, when he took office, he said he was going to lead a reform process like no other. And I have to say, I have been quite impressed by the gains made in the last 2 years or so, with all of the member states voting to make these reforms a success. One of the things that the reforms attempts to do is to bring the system together, because we are a very large organization. Just here in Fiji, we have 26 UN agencies that work here. And, you know, in the past, we didn't always even share information with each other. So one part of it is to actually make this a coherent, cohesive response to the challenges and the needs of a country. And so you take COVID-19, for example. In the past, you would have, you know, somebody dealing just with the health sector, somebody else not even talking to the health sector folks, dealing with livelihoods. But you know they're interconnected because they're the same people. You know, it's your family and your neighbor's family, and whether it's jobs or health or education. The other thing is that they've tried very hard to minimize the bureaucracy and expenses in delivering these services. And I can say that, you know, we've made some progress already globally and including here in the Pacific. You know, bringing, for instance, the different parts of the UN under one roof, making sure that the administrative work is done as one rather than, you know, in parallel and so on. And that reduces the cost of doing business. But more certainly can be done. Now, for the future, you know, one of the things I think that we have learned from this pandemic is that working together is fundamental. Going it alone is not going to work. Some years back, I remember saying that the greatest wall that we know as a wall exists in China. And this is before COVID-19. I remember saying, although it's an aesthetic beauty and it's a historical masterpiece, it's not a wall that's going to protect the people of China from anything. Certainly not a virus, whether it comes in the air or comes through a computer. So we know we live in an interconnected world, and we absolutely need multilateral aid entities like the UN. So rather than actually say, well, the UN is not working, what we need to do is to really join hands and strengthen the institutions that we have to make it work. And one of the things that we have seen working, although again not sufficient, is the equitable response to this pandemic. We see that the vaccine distribution, although Fiji has been very fortunate, is not happening quite the same way in other parts of the world, in Asia and in Africa, you know, where 3-4% of the population have received vaccines, and many healthcare workers and frontline workers don't have vaccines. So the issue of working together is fundamental. in preparing for crisis, whether we're talking about a pandemic or a climate emergency, and also in terms of responding.
Thank you for that response. Just a very final question before we wrap up. Is there any final message that you have for the people of Fiji?
Well, that's interesting when you say people of Fiji, because I think that's fundamentally it. This organization is about people, and I think it's really important that we make that connection to people. Fiji and Fijians have done a lot through and with the UN. UN peacekeepers, for instance. Fiji is one of the largest per capita contributors around the world through the UN to peacekeeping, and sadly 65 souls have lost their lives. There are very many other ways that Fiji has contributed to making the world a safer, more prosperous place, right? But the flip side is also important, that Fijians, individuals, families, people need to feel that this organization belongs to them. And I think during my tenure here, along with my team, one of the things I'd like to really see is that connection becoming stronger. And so we've been going around, as you know, several times to the Lau Islands. We spent a lot of time during cyclones in Vanuatu. We've been in Kandavu, sitting with communities, making that connection. And as part of making that connection, I think is what we really need to do is to be also more accountable to those who we are here to serve. It's not only to the governments. It is important to be accountable to governments, but it's also being accountable to the people that we are serving, and working in partnership with civil society organizations, with the private sector, as Ambassador Prasad has mentioned, is an area, it's new for the UN, but it's something that we really must do much more.
Thank you for your time, Mr. Samarasinha, and to Mr. Prasad as well. Thank you very much for making yourself available and joining us this evening. We hope you enjoyed the show this evening. When we come back next time, we'll have the same our two guests that joined us this evening, and the subject of discussion will be on climate change. So keep watching. Thank you for joining us, and have a good evening.